Hello and welcome to our little mini lecture here. My name's Paul Rowe and I'm the head of French, and I also lead the Introduction to French Studies module every year, which gives students an idea of the kinds of things that they can expect to study as they go through the course and begin to specialise a little bit more. And every year we start off by talking about the Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen, one of the founding documents of the French Republic, drafted and introduced in 1789 at the moment of the French Revolution. And this sets out a lot of ideas that kind of echo through French-speaking cultures and indeed world cultures thereafter. And this year, with the situation with COVID, we knew that we wouldn't be getting together on campus as readily as normal, and that people would not meet their lecturers face to face as much as they normally would. So we decided to take a slightly different approach and to ask, rather than me just giving a lecture on the Déclaration, I asked colleagues to respond to different aspects of the Déclaration and to talk about their relevance to their own work and to their own teaching. And I thought that would be quite a nice thing to use for this presentation. So I'm just going to show you three sort of mini lectures that talk about different aspects of the Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen. We're going to start off with Alison Fell talking about the title of the Déclaration. I'll talk a little bit about the preamble to it, and then we'll move into French, and we'll have two colleagues, John Segar and Catherine Kaiserman, who will talk about the use of language in the Déclaration. Okay, so we'll work our way through this presentation.
Hi, I'm Alison Fell, and I'm here to talk about the title, the Déclaration des droits de l'homme, and particularly about that final word, l'homme. So, l'homme in the Déclaration is a kind of abstract concept. It refers to a universal individual as a unit of national sovereignty, which represented an enormous shift from the Ancien Régime, an absolute monarchy, that preceded it. It also potentially provided a framework for women to argue for their rights, if you understand l'homme as meaning humanity as opposed to man or men. And in fact, I'm going to give the lecture on one woman, Olympe de Gouges, who did exactly that and wrote a very provocative response to the Déclaration des droits de l'homme called La Déclaration des droits de la femme in 1791. De Gouges argues that women too should have rights and responsibilities. They should be seen as active citizens of this new state. But it wasn't taken seriously at the time, and women really didn't make many gains in terms of their rights for decades and centuries after the publication of the Déclaration, because it proved very difficult for campaigners for more civil rights for women to persuade people in France that l'homme didn't refer to a male body, that in fact l'homme could be understood as humanity. For many, and probably including the white property-owning men who wrote La Déclaration, l'homme wasn't humanity, it was man, and women were fundamentally different and therefore should have a different relationship to the state. This conundrum in the heart of French history and politics has been very close to my own research interests, which for the last 15 years or so have focused on women and war, and particularly the First World War. So in France, one of the consequences of the Déclaration and the way that it understood French citizenship was military service. So, following the initial 1789 revolution, France was in an almost continual state of war, internally to some extent, but also externally with other monarchies, which then led to the Napoleonic Wars. So, quite quickly, citizenship, or the responsibilities of citizenship, in exchange for which you had your rights, meant military service for men. So being prepared to fight and obviously risk your life for the country. It was very hard for women to claim citizenship, given that they didn't perform military service, didn't bear arms. If you just think of the words of the French national anthem, La Marseillaise, the first line is Aux armes, citoyens. Women couldn't bear arms. So they had to try and find other ways to claim their rights through their responsibilities and duties to the country, to the homeland. And some women tried to do this, for example, through motherhood, arguing that because women provided future citizens, educated future citizens, and they too deserved rights, because that was their responsibility to the state. But in fact, it wasn't until after the Second World War in 1944 that women finally got the right to vote in France. So it just shows that there was a very persistent, really, connection between l'homme in la Déclaration des droits de l'homme and men, even though it really was an abstract concept at the beginning that could be understood to be talking about human rights as much as the rights of individual male French citizens.
As you look at the preamble to the Déclaration, you'll see that what it does is to answer a few questions. It asks, who is making this declaration? Why are they making it? How are they achieving their goals? What are they doing? What are their aims? And there's a kind of conclusion that they come to. I'm going to leave you to read through the document for yourself to kind of try and figure out what is being said there. But one of the things I'd like you to pay attention to as you do that is the language of the document. First of all, it may seem obvious, but it is in French. It is in the language of the people. Now French was very widely used in administration even before the revolution. But nonetheless, it is an important choice, and it marks a continuing shift away from the use of Latin for legal and learned texts that had been part of the tradition. Okay, so it's written in a language that every French person, in theory, could understand, although there are some caveats that one could have about that. There are regional languages, for example, and dialects, for example, in Alsace, which are not recognisable as French. But nevertheless, it's in the national language. It's also written, I think, quite clearly. It's very structured language. It's coherent. The ideas belong together and kind of follow on from one another logically. What's more, it's very cohesive language. It's explicitly connected together. The different ideas have some kind of connector that indicates what the logical flow is of the language. And this is something that is very common in educated French style, perhaps one might say to a greater extent than in English, although we're talking in generalizations here. There is some jargon in there, things like pouvoir exécutif, but it's not very sort of obscure jargon, and generally it's written in a formal style, but not a willfully obscure one. In other words, once again, this is something that is aiming to communicate clearly with a wide readership of at least some education. One might say that it is une langue cartésienne, a Cartesian language. And Cartesian is a reference to René Descartes, who wrote a lot of his work in Latin, but also wrote the Discours de la Méthode in French in order to communicate his key ideas to as wide a readership as possible, and who championed the use not only of very clear rational thinking, but also very clear rational expression of those thoughts. And that trope of Cartesian language is one that is often associated, not least by sort of French people themselves, with the French language and its good use.
Alors, bonjour, donc je me présente, je m'appelle Catherine Kaiserman et j'enseigne la langue ici à Leeds. Et mon collègue?
Bonjour, moi aussi je me présente, je m'appelle John Sager. Moi aussi j'enseigne la langue française, mais je fais aussi partie de l'équipe qui assure des cours de cinéma et d'interprétariat aussi. Mais c'est surtout pour les cours de langue que vous risquez de me voir le plus, et même peut-être trop.
Alors, aujourd'hui, ce qu'on pensait faire tous les deux, c'était de regarder donc cette déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen, mais du point de vue de la langue. Donc, la première chose qu'on pourrait peut-être dire, d'abord, c'est que la syntaxe française est souvent beaucoup plus complexe. Quand on parle de la syntaxe, c'est-à-dire la structure des phrases, c'est souvent beaucoup plus complexe qu'en anglais, avec des phrases très longues. Et par exemple, si on prend le préambule, l'introduction à la déclaration, c'est pratiquement une seule phrase qui dure pendant tout le paragraphe, avec des propositions indépendantes, des propositions principales, des propositions subordonnées, et beaucoup de ponctuation. On utilise peut-être plus les virgules, les points-virgules, justement pour mettre de l'ordre dans ces longues phrases. Donc ça, c'est peut-être quelque chose à retenir quand vous étudiez la langue française. Et John, tu avais quelque chose à dire sur le registre?
Oui, aussi, moi j'aimerais aussi signaler le registre, ce qu'on appelle le registre, c'est-à-dire le ton de ce morceau. Surtout, moi je trouve la langue très très modérée, qui veut dire que la personne qui l'a rédigé était très conscient du fait que ça s'écrivait à une époque révolutionnaire et que cette personne n'avait pas très envie de dramatiser la situation. C'est-à-dire que cette personne cherche à rassurer le peuple, mais met beaucoup l'accent sur des questions d'égalité et de la loi. Et en même temps, on demande aux citoyens d'être responsables, parce qu'eux aussi, ils ont une très grande contribution à faire.
Alors, si on prend un ou deux exemples maintenant des articles spécifiques, on pourrait commencer avec l'article 4. Et moi, ce qui m'a frappé dans cet article, c'est peut-être l'utilisation de pronoms indéfinis. Ça rend le ton très impersonnel, très général. On a par exemple tout ce qui ne nuit pas, all that which. Et puis on a autrui. Alors autrui, c'est un synonyme de les autres personnes, les autres gens, mais ça rend le style, le ton encore plus impersonnel. Oui. John, tu avais quelque chose à dire sur...
Moi, j'avais remarqué l'emploi de ce qu'on appelle en français les connecteurs, c'est-à-dire l'emploi du mot ainsi, qui d'habitude c'est un adverbe si vous voulez, mais ici on l'emploie comme une conjonction, c'est-à-dire c'est un mot qui sert à relier vos pensées, et va vous aider en principe à mieux persuader la personne qui va lire, qui va écouter ce que vous avez à dire. Alors, ce sont des mots très très importants pour formuler vos arguments, vos idées.
Et moi, ce qui m'a frappé aussi, c'est que la liberté, en fait, ici, est définie plutôt presque négativement. Donc, on ne dit pas ce en quoi la liberté consiste, mais plutôt ce en quoi elle ne consiste pas. Donc, il y a des restrictions, et donc, c'est peut-être pour ça qu'ils utilisent ne que deux fois. Oui, ne que, qui en fait veut dire la même chose que seulement. Mais le fait que c'est no que, ça élève le registre, c'est plus sophistiqué, mais aussi ça met l'accent sur cette restriction, non, cet élément de restriction, il me semble.
Okay, I hope that's given you at least some idea of the kinds of things that we do on the degree course here at Leeds. Today's presentation was really focused on history and politics and language, but on that Introduction to French Studies module, and optionally as you go through the degree, you can cover all sorts of different aspects of the cultures and societies of the French and Francophone world. So we do literature, cinema, bande dessinée on that Introduction to French Studies module, and you can really follow your interests thereafter. Okay, thanks for listening to us, and we hope to see you at Leeds in the future.